Hello, welcome to week 2 of remote learning. Today is Monday, March 30th. I think we did a good job last week. Most of us are logging in and in the right class period at the right time. Some of us need to, tidy that up, be in our first period, our second period, third period when we're supposed to be, and completing the work every day. It's just going to be easier for everybody to make sure that the work is submitted every day so that you get timely grades, timely feedback, and we all know what's going on as we move forward. There's a little bit of notes I want to go over before the lesson and before the readings, and we get to our work. Please remember your work will always have the date on it, right? It is labeled 3:30. Please submit it on 3:30 on Monday. And it is always going to be a Google Doc. That's the assignments that you will always have. Sometimes the PDFs, like this here, will be what we get our information from, okay? But the Google Doc is what you're gonna be able to type on and always be submitting. So where we left off last week was with the policy of containment after World War II. So you have the Soviet Union and the United States kind of butting heads. The US was giving billions of dollars to countries to not be communist through the Marshall Plan. And the Truman Doctrine basically just said, it was a document done by President Truman that said the US was going to contain communism at all costs. We were not going to let it spread. So we can see in the 1950s and 60s, two places where it wants to spread is into Korea and Vietnam. And we can see also, right, it kind of makes sense because they are next to China. So the Soviet Union is the first communist country. And the second is China in 1949, which we've already discussed. We've discussed Mao, and that being that Korea and Vietnam are two of China's neighbors, communism naturally spreads there next. The United States and Soviet Union divide both countries along a parallel, or kind of like an imaginary line across the countries, north and south. The northern part close to China, so they become communist and a dictatorship in North Vietnam and North Korea, whereas the southern parts are not democratic though, unfortunately. They are capitalist. South Korea becomes democratic, but definitely the South Vietnamese leader of the time was a dictator, but just capitalist and taking money from the US. Okay, moving on. Let me erase that. Okay, moving on, we should also notice that it's a similar situation with Germany. You've got Germany divided into the West, capitalist democratic, right, tied to the US, and East Germany tied to the Soviet Union, communist and dictatorship. There are two leaders for the communist parties or the communist countries in both North Korea and North Vietnam. The leader of North Korea is Kim Il-sung. He is the father of Kim Jong-il and the grandfather of Kim Jong-un, right? That is the only dynastic communist country in the world. Usually, otherwise, we have communist countries, just the next strongest leader, the next military leader becomes the dictator. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh should look kind of familiar. Some of us did for our project on nationalism. He was actually pretty progressive. Out of all the communist leaders, he studied in Paris. He wrote a Declaration of Independence for Vietnam. He had lots of democratic ideas, but he took money from the Soviet Union and from China, so that made him the United States' enemy. All right, I'm going to get rid of my picture and just show you some impacts of these wars. So what we get is this demilitarized zone, or DMZ, in between these two countries, North Korea and Vietnam to begin with. Now, the difference is that in Korea, this DMZ, this demilitarized zone where no military is allowed, still exists today. Whereas in Vietnam, it becomes one country. Okay, so this is what the DMZ in South Korea looks like today. You got soldiers marching up and down. Okay, it is clearly divided, two separate countries. You cannot get in. Next, the effects of the Korean War. South Korea completely recovered. They are one of the US's strongest allies. We actually still have 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea. And while the North, we know they remain communist and are extremely poor even still to this day. We can see here that from outer space, you got Japan over here. Oops. Japan over here on the right, China on the left, South Korea right here. In this outline section is North Korea that does experience blackouts, or they just sometimes turn the power off because they're communist, they're dictatorship, they can do what they want, the government. Vietnam, similar, this is kind of seen as like one of the worst parts of United States history, where people weren't really sure why we were fighting in this war. We definitely probably as a military targeted civilians more than we should have and used some tactics that were not necessarily really nice. So this image right here, this is of a napalm explosion. And but the problem was we couldn't find the North Vietnamese soldiers because they were hiding in the jungle, and we decided that, oh, if we can't find them because of the jungle, let's burn the jungle down. So napalm was this chemical substance that wouldn't stop burning. You put water on it and it got stronger. You tried to fan it, it got stronger. And so here you can see this little girl who was burned by napalm. Again, here, this is a very famous photo of the time period where, unfortunately, usually the people who were target or in the middle of the fighting were children, women, elderly, people that had no part of the fighting. Don't worry about the Tet Offensive. We'll skip over that. Back in the U.S., this was the hippie era, where people were protesting U.S.'s involvement in the Vietnam War. Why are we there? We're not sure. Right? This is the yep, all the same instance also of the civil rights movement. So there's a lot of political and social unrest going on in the United States. Lots of protests, lots of marching. This is where we see people dodging the draft as well. We, the United States, have not had a draft since then. That's always on people's minds as they're getting close to turning 18. You know, what about if they get drafted into the Army? We have only done that a few times in history, but it's definitely part of the Vietnam War. And we definitely see celebrities, musicians, actors, actresses getting involved in politics during this time and voicing their opinions about the US's involvement or domestic and foreign policies. So again, just to rehash a little bit, Korea and Vietnam are similar, is that they are both begin with the North as communist, the South as capitalist. Ironically, they were all dictatorships at the time. Korea, South Korea in particular, has become democratic recently. The difference is that Korea is still divided today along that 53rd parallel. The DMZ is still there. It is two divided countries. Vietnam, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, becomes a fully communist country and still is fully communist country today. All right, that's all for notes. Get rid of that. So here is your your classwork today. Just a little bit about the Korean War, a little bit about the Vietnam War, and then you can submit it. Here are the documents that we're going to read. Page 1 just shows us the two sides of the war, of the Cold War. United States, the USA on one side, Soviet Union on the other side, right? And we've had a couple of slides about this where the economic system is capitalism and democracy. Their allies are NATO. The USSR's allies are the Warsaw Pact. Their command economy or communism. Political system is a dictatorship, communism, right? So things we've all done before. These are the 4 Cold War hotspots where the Cold War becomes hot. So I'll read this section here. The Cold War emerged as a series of wars and conflicts between the United States and their NATO allies. and the Soviet Union and their Warsaw Pact allies. Even though the Cold War began in Europe, it spread around the world. Below are examples of 4 Cold War conflicts. So today, you're responsible for the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and the Vietnam War, 1954 to 1975. Okay, see, right next to China, and Vietnam, again, right next to China. Tomorrow, you'll be looking at Cuba and Afghanistan. Okay, so I'll read the document and we can begin to look at some of the questions. So, the Korean War, 1950 to 1953. The Korean War is the name given to a civil war between the nations of North Korea and South Korea, which were created out of the occupation zones of the Soviet Union and the United States established at the end of World War II. The conflict began on June 25, 1950, and fighting continued until an armistice on July 27, 1953. Although since no official peace treaty was signed, the war is still not technically over. The Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, seeking to expand the communist sphere of influence, aided the North Koreans, while forces representing the United Nations, led primarily by the United States, with troops provided by 15 other nations, aided the South Koreans. The Korean War pitted American and Soviet hardware against each other without the threat of an all-out nuclear strikes. The limited nuclear strikes were discussed once the Chinese became involved. Okay, so from this, we definitely maybe should highlight that it is a 3-year conflict. That we've got Soviet Union and China expanding. And we've got the US on each other's side. Okay, down here. Each side wanted to unite the Korean Peninsula under its own political ideology. That's important. They each wanted to unify. Finally, after massive swings in favor of both the North and the South, meaning that both countries kind of started winning and then the other side would take over and they'd kind of go back and forth, North and South. At the end of the conflict, Korea remained divided along the 38th parallel. So after the 3 years, they basically got back to that same spot. The demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, between the two nations is still the most heavily fortified border in the world. There is a constant hope among the populations of both North and South that Korea will again be united under one flag. So it's still a goal of North Korea to unite all of Korea as one country, and it's still a goal of South Korea to unite as one country. Okay, so here is a photo of the US Marines fighting to help South Koreans, watching bombs exploding on Chinese troops who assisted the North Koreans. Right. Okay. Let's look at our work for today. So let's look at some of the questions. What did the US and its allies want during the Korean War? We wanted to stop the spread of communism and unite Korea. Okay, let's change the color. A little bigger for you guys too. Next, the United States and its allies supported who? We know they supported South Korea. What did the Soviet Union and its allies want during the Korean War? They wanted to spread communism and unite Korea. And they supported North Korea. Okay. Now you don't have to do this. I'm just making them red and blue because I've done that throughout other slides. How did the Korean War impact Korea? Well, what happened? So we know that there was a war. We can, yes, say the obvious that many people died. We could, go back to our notes. What else do we see? There is the DMZ that was created. They are still technically fighting the war, that there was no peace, and still divided. Okay, and last question. Hi, Bennett. Are you going to have a muffin? Yes. Last question. As a result of the Korean War, was communism contained or expanded? Did it spread? Please explain to your best ability. I guess if you even want to say it was neither contained nor expanded because they ultimately stayed exactly in the same spot, that is up to you. Okay. You can, again, continue the same 4 questions for the Vietnam War. I'll read that for you. And again, if you feel like you need a little more information on the Korean War, definitely do some of your own Google searches. There's lots of information, even just Wikipedia is fine for something like this. You're not writing an essay, you're not doing larger projects, you're just getting background information. Okay, so for those of you, I will read this last document and then sign off for today. All right, the Vietnam War, 1954 to 1975. Why did this conflict begin? The Vietnam War was a long and expensive war between the communist regime of North Vietnam and the Viet Cong, the communist-led guerrillas. Guerrillas are not unorganized. Do you want to say hi? You sure? Real quick. Yes! Anyway, guerrillas are non-government funded forces. They usually do sneak attacks and hide and stuff like that. Okay, so the war is between North Vietnam and the anti-communist South Vietnam and its ally, the United States, because again, we like to always get our nose in everywhere around the world. The communist regime of the North wanted to unify Vietnam, right? We should see that as a reoccurring theme, into a single state that would be based on a communist ideology. In 1958, the Viet Cong began to battle the South Vietnamese government. Motivated by a policy of containment, the U.S. pledged support for the anti-communist South Vietnam. The United States and its allies provided training and equipment for the American military. The United States also deployed large numbers of military personnel to South Vietnam. Later in the war, the United States launched airstrikes and committed more foot soldiers. From 1968 to 1973, efforts were made to end the conflict through diplomacy or dialogue. By January 1973, an agreement was reached and the United States forces were withdrawn from Vietnam and United States prisoners of war were released. Oh dear. All right, crisis averted. Back at it. Where were we? I guess we can go up here, right? United States containment, South Vietnam, we provide military. Let's highlight that. Okay, so we left off here. From 1968 to 1973, efforts were made to end the conflict through diplomacy or dialogue. By January 1973, an agreement was reached and the United States forces were withdrawn from Vietnam and the United States prisoners of war were released. In 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to the North. Vietnam was unified as a communist country called the Soviet Republic of Vietnam. So that is something that is different from Korea. The Vietnam War had disastrous effects. Vietnam's infrastructure was destroyed and farmland was polluted by American chemical warfare, Agent Orange, or the napalm. An estimated 2 million Vietnamese died and another 3 million were wounded. About 12 million became refugees who fled to neighboring countries. During the Vietnam War, 58,000 Americans died in Vietnam, and the war cost the United States millions of dollars. The United States' entrance into the war led to protests by students and others at home in the United States. Despite all the money and troops the United States sacrificed, it failed to contain communism. Okay, so let's also highlight that. Finally, by 1973, Nixon announced that America was abandoning the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so we're giving up on that. Or the doctrine that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under the threat from external or internal communist forces. So after the Vietnam War, we're like, we're not getting involved anymore. We don't care about containing communism, or so we say, but I don't think that's true. Okay, so after reading those couple documents, make sure you go back and answer the 8 questions for today. Okay, when you're done, submit and you can get that in. Nice, easy grade. And tomorrow we'll pick up with Afghanistan and Cuba. All right, if you have any questions, please make sure you are joining into our class video chats or emailing me or posting comments on the stream. Okay, have a great day. See you tomorrow.